of bringing this series together, which is to really, have both a multidisciplinary but a multi-stakeholder conversation. That is the academics talking with professionals and policymakers to create some kind of community where we can have real good in-depth discussion. This series is being co-organized here at Oxford, myself at the business school, and also Julian Corj, who is also at the business school. And we'll do a fortnightly meeting from today onwards, all the way up to June. So I hope that you can join quite a few of them. And the purpose is to really look at the notion of responsible AI with respect to policy making, but also how professionals of various sorts are responding to the challenges of this technology to make it responsibly used. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. And Professor Philipp Hacker, who is really an authority, particularly in Europe, around regulation. And I do want to pitch for his expertise in that area. He's currently at the New School of Digital Studies. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over to him to talk about responsible generative AI. He'll talk for like 30, 40 minutes. I think it's difficult to interrupt in this format. So if you have questions or comments, if you could put that in the chat function as we go along. And then we can take up some of those at the end. And of course, raise your electronic hands if you have questions at the end as well. So over to you, Philipp. Thank you so much for kicking off this series. Over to you.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Mari, for this wonderful introduction. And thanks to both you and Julian for inviting me to kick off this really inspiring and exciting series of talks. I'm looking forward to the future ones as well. Sorry I can't join you today live at Oxford. It's always a place that I come to with great pleasure. But so we have an international audience today, so all the better that we're all reunited here in virtual formats. As you know, the AI Action Summit is kicking off in Paris right now, so it's a good moment to take a step back or plunge right into the AI frenzy, depending on how you see it, and think about not only how we can accelerate AI development and deployment in the EU and beyond, which certainly is of great concern, but also how we can do this in a way that is responsible and that is societally relevant and beneficial. Because of course, innovation is important, but innovation, I think, is not a value in and out of itself, but rather because it furthers certain other societal goals, economic growth among them, but also ethical and legal concerns that arise with respect to these models and systems. So I have been involved quite actively in the regulatory field in this and in the AI space. I should also disclose I'm currently advising both the German federal government and the European Parliament, but whatever I'm saying here is, of course, in my very own capacity. So now, I want to start off this short presentation by thinking through with you some key dimensions of what might be called responsible generative AI. So my key focus would be on the one hand, mapping out some few distinctions and particularly relevant concepts, but also trying to distinguish what is specific about generative AI vis-a-vis non-generative, or we could call it traditional AI or predictive AI, as it's also sometimes called. So let's start out with an example, a concrete example, which is slightly hypothetical, but I can already tell you that this is already in practice, and I've already advised companies who are doing precisely this. So you take a large language model, which is abbreviated usually as LLM, and if you have legal scholars around here, this is not your master of laws in this case. So you have an LLM-based system, and this is doing the following. It looks at, it creates a mapping in order to look at the matching or optimize the matching between job applicants and those who are seeking candidates. And now what's happening is that on the in the first round, you want to look at the job description, so the advertisement basically for the job, and extract the key requirements and skills. And for that, you need natural language processing. It's basically what's behind generative AI tools such as GPT-4. So you extract this, and then you take the resume of the candidate and again extract the information from that and from the cover letter, and you project both of these descriptions in a mathematically optimized format into a joint embedding space. It's basically a gigantic storage space that contains all kinds of mathematical descriptions of documents. And then you can use a different ranking system that matches the description or the job description, the advertisement against the resume. And you can get a kind of a score of how well it matches. And then you have another tool that ranks these candidates according to some metrics and gives you, for example, a kind of job performance score. Now, this is what's already happening when you look at big platforms that are facilitating matchmaking in the workplace field. And this is, of course, an angle or a perspective where, and a scenario where AI can be of immense benefit. I mean, think of course, if you have your own company, or even if you're at a university and you want to hire a new research assistant, sometimes you're totally overloaded with applications. Of course, the temptation is very high to just have AI do part of the job for you. What could possibly go wrong? As we all know, or many of us know, I guess, a lot of things can go wrong with this, both from a technical and from a societal perspective. So that's why I want to map out these three pillars, I'd call them, of responsible generative AI. And let's see where we get to in terms of mitigation efforts, which are underway, but which are sometimes much harder for generative than for traditional AI. So the first pillar I want to have a look at is bias and discrimination. Now, this is something that has haunted the field of AI for a long time, but it is also something that is absolutely embedded, unfortunately, in generative AI systems. And there are many different studies. I've just brought with me this UNESCO report that looked at, in this case, Llama 2, but you could actually pick, so Llama 2 is an open source meta model from Meta, but you could basically pick any kind of model. And what they found is when you enter a gay person is, in 70% of the cases, that was completed with a negative connotation, including statements that were really, such as the one that is depicted here, that are really against any kind of equality and inclusion that we might want to see, and that we do want to see in our society. So this is, of course, striking. This is, to a certain extent, not surprising, because these models were trained on open data on the internet. And it's clear that the internet is, of course, a place where not all statements are passed through a politically correction mechanism filter. I think some of the persons on the call need to mute themselves, such as Anna or others. That would be helpful. Thank you. So the problem, however, extends beyond mere text. So if we go to generative AI models that produce images, here we can see a study or an investigative reporting by the Washington Post, which basically had as its prompt only a portrait photo of, and then on the one hand, person at social services, and then a productive person. And I think it does not really need much explanation to see that there's a striking both gender and ethnic origin difference in these different images. And those were very contemporaneous models. And you can, again, do this for different models. And many times you will find these kind of unequal representations or biases. So what's similar and what's different from what we know in terms of discrimination and bias in traditional models? Well, in both cases, it's often because of the training data, because the training data contains historical either data in the sense of data points, performance scores, exam scores that were tainted themselves with bias, or in the case of generative AI, of course, discriminatory speech or biased speech products. And then sometimes you have issues like selection bias, where it might be the case that one group is over or underrepresented in the training data. So for example, if you have a historical data set that is looking at a gender distribution, or that incorporates gender distributions in the medical sector, this, by the way, is a prompt that I did now 1.5 years ago on Nurse and Doctor for DALL-E 2. And the interesting thing,
พี่หลง
if you look at
FPT
that,
2 อะไร
if you
อ่ะ
look at that image, thank you
ใช่
for muting yourselves.
พี่อยู่บางครั้งที่ต้องมาบอกพี่
Thank
เบ
you,
ลว่า
Ronson.
ตอนเนี้ย
Thank you.
เขา
Please, if you
เริ่ม
could
เปิด
all
อะไร
mute
บ้าง
yourselves,
แล้ว
that'd be
มัน
very
จะมี
helpful.
ทางนี้
Thank
นะ
you.
พี่เบลต้องเตรียมตัวอะไรต้องแบ่งอะไรมาอะไรอย่างเงี้ย
So
ก็ต้อง
I
ถาม
cannot
นั่นแหละ
I cannot mute these participants, but thank you. So I did this 1.5 years ago, and what you can see here is that, well, you have two persons, but if you are somewhat trained in the medical field, you immediately see that there's one person taking notes, and that's usually the one that's inferior in position. That's the woman here. And then there's the doctor that's just asking the smart questions, basically, and that's the male person. So this is a more nuanced version of a bias. That could also be the other way around, but oftentimes, unfortunately, we see it this way around. So the difference, I guess, would be that where we have before, we had scores that were different between different protected groups. Now it's about more subtle and sometimes less subtle versions of language and communication. And this means that we also have other types of damage. It's not just the fact that your credit score is 9 instead of a 10, but it's also the case that this might, connect deeply to your own personality, your identity, and other really important traits of your personality. And what I want to stress here is that on a technical level, this makes it much harder to solve, because the whole debate, of course, the whole field of what counts as fair or not fair in depictions, in language, and so on, is deeply contested, as we all know, and even more so, of course, since President Trump has been reelected in the U.S., we see this kind of culture war again at the forefront. Now, when we are talking about scores, and I have brought with me here just a slide from, or a snapshot from one of our papers on this. This one is called Matching Code and Law. We also have a more recent one that was just published in Artificial Intelligence that's called Beyond Incompatibility. So basically what you usually have is you have different score distributions between different protected groups. And that's the case of what you see here in the graph on the left-hand side. You have different groups, they score differently. And what you can do with mathematical procedures, so we used optimal transport on this one, is to basically bring these scores closer to one another, approximate them, or make them even almost identical. So with scores, that's kind of an easy thing to do. There is a lot of nuance to it, and there's a lot of complexity in the details, but basically the concept is fairly straightforward. Now, how do you do this with, content such as language, such as images? It's not as simple as just adjusting a number of scores. Lily, if you could, thank you. Of course, you would have to build a wholly different image, different parameter space to address this, to even capture it and then address it in a way that seems appropriate both to you and the addressees. And we've already seen, of course, cases where this went perhaps a little bit too far in the other direction. You might remember these instances of Gemini, the Google image generation tool that then generated kind of racially diverse images of Nazi soldiers, popes, and US founding fathers. So again, there is sometimes a trade-off then between perceived degree of equality versus historical accuracy and other metrics in the space. So all I want to say is it remains very complicated, and with generative AI, it's actually getting more complicated when it comes to bias and discrimination. If you want to learn more about the legal foundations, we have a new paper out there that I co-authored with Sandra Wachter and Brent Mittelstadt out of Oxford and Frederick Zuderwin-Borgesius, and it's called Generative Discrimination, and you can find it on Archive, and that looks at the whole legal space around this in much more detail. Now, let's walk over to a second pillar of responsible AI and responsible generative AI, particularly also, and that is explainability. We all know that AI systems can be opaque. They don't have to be opaque. There are very simple AI models that, like linear regression or logistic regression that can be easily interpreted, but others are much more complex. And that becomes a problem when these models are somewhat involved in high stakes decision making, because sometimes you're unable to say why a certain decision was taken that way, and maybe it was taken for the wrong reasons, and that means that it will not generalize well to other similarly looking scenarios, which, however, are somewhat different in nuances. However, what's perhaps even more concerning with respect to, or equally concerning when we think about generative AI, are cases like this. It's hallucinations or inventions of confabulations, they're also sometimes called. So it's basically cases where the output does make a factual claim that is essentially untrue. And this hit a colleague of mine at Georgetown Law, a law professor who was basically indicted by ChatGPT to have sexually harassed a student. And this is, of course, something that's very serious, but nothing ever happened to the slightest extent with this professor. But this is something that's very hard to erase from your record once this has been public in, so and so many ChatGPT posts or queries and answers. So this is a real concern, of course, when it comes to not only data protection, but also the protection of privacy and personality rights. And again, since we do not know precisely how these models work, it's very hard to make sure that these instances do not reoccur. In fact, what's different in Gen AI concern vis-a-vis traditional AI is first the high degree of complexity. In traditional models, you might have, a couple of thousand or 100,000 or even millions of parameters. But here you have billions and sometimes even trillions of parameters in large generative AI models. And these interactions become extremely hard to trace. What is usually done when you think of, for example, image recognition systems is that you engage in ex post explanations. And one way to instantiate these ex post explanations, even in highly complex AI models, such as deep neural networks, are perturbation methods. So what you do basically is you change the input features just a little bit, you change the values a little bit, and you check which of these perturbations, which of these changes make the biggest difference in output. And then you can say, that's the one that is particularly sensitive, that is particularly relevant for the output. Now, if you have billions or trillions of parameters, it could, as it is easy to imagine, has been shown in a recent paper by actually colleagues of mine from TU, from the Technical University of Berlin, from the team of Wojciech Zamek, that this is computationally inefficient. You can easily imagine this. If you want to try out trillions of, different parameter constellations, that's just doesn't work. So one of the key methods for rendering complex neural networks that are in traditional catalogs neural networks explainable does not work well or not at all in generative AI. Also, is the problem that the outputs are highly varied and oftentimes multimodal. So if you have one technique that works for language, that might not work well for images and vice versa. Plus, of course, you have these user-defined interactions via prompts that can prompt also the model to change its behavior, as we know from jailbreaking, and it can even lead to model drift, which means that the model changes away from the goals that it was initially supposed to fulfill. And finally, we also have more transparency aspects than in traditional models. You might want to know, how do the training data connect to a certain output? Or how does the model structure link to it? The decision process, or even the prompts themselves. You know, what's the is it the prompt that prompted this result, or is it the training data, or the constellation of both? And what is the source really of hallucinations like the ones that we've seen that accuse the professor of sexual harassment? So we have, again, a landscape that is marked by a significant degree of complexity and uncertainty. Now, how does this square with the law? I've just brought with me some overview of the case law, and this is based, if you're a lawyer, on the Ola and Uber cases, and also basically the opinion of the Advocate General in the CK case at the CJU. So those are cases that were held in the Netherlands. Uber drivers basically suing Uber to know why they were fired, why they were assigned certain riders, and also a high-profile case under discussion at the moment at the CJU, the Court of Justice of the European Union. So what emanates from these cases? Basically, what these courts say, and what the Advocate General, the CJU decision is not yet out, but what the Advocate General says, and that's kind of likely at least that the CJU will say the same thing, are four things. First, you need to explain the factors taken into account in the decision-making process. That means the factors in each individual decision. Those are the key factors, or in AI language, the key features, and that's what's called in explainable AI local explanations. Now this, as we've just seen, is extremely hard to implement with generative AI because, or it's not yet extremely hard, but it's at least hard. There are some mechanisms that try to do this. Attention LRP is one take at getting there, but it's hard because there are just so many of these features. Then what you also have to do is not only do you have to give basically the reasoning for your individual case, but also you're legally required under the GDPR to give the weighting of the different features at an aggregate level. So basically the person wants to know, or has a right to know, why was I denied the, say, credit application? And what is usually the kind of decision-making framework for credit applications? For example, it could be the case that I am denied credit because of my income and my shoe size, but then generally it's income and collateral and some other factors and my job maybe that is taken into account. And so I could argue that, the fact that you took shoe size into account perhaps, gives me a good case in overruling this decision. Well, there could also be cases where this factor, of course, if it's, has to do with number of baby breaks that you took, that is something that points to discrimination on the basis of gender. So that is very hard to do, these global explanations, because for generative AI models, because for that to happen, you need to have a global understanding, a general understanding of how the model works in the abstract. And that's just extremely hard to get by. Basically, what you can do is you can do hypothesis, you can do testing, but that will only ever look at a certain amount, subspace of all the possible cases. And then also, the explanations need to be complete enough for the data subject, so the affected person, to understand the reasons for the decision. And again, that's hard to do because it might be some funny mid-level concepts that arise somewhere in the medium layers, whatever, somewhere in the deep neural network structure, and that might not even have a representation in our human language. So again, oftentimes it will be hard in deep neural networks and in Gen AI in particular. What is the only thing that is actually feasible is one thing that that the courts agree on, and also most observers, that you do not need to completely explain the algorithm or the model itself to the user. Well, at least that's a relief, but all the rest of these stories that we've seen are really hard to comply with under the GDPR. And So it should not come as a surprise that NoYB, which is the NGO of Max Schrems, the famous data protection activist from Austria, has actually filed a complaint with the Austrian Data Protection Authority that is under investigation right now, and that is precisely about hallucinations in the case of OpenAI. And what they say is, it provides wrong information, and OpenAI says, yeah, we know that, but we cannot help it. We cannot correct it. And that, of course, sets up a really, well, from a scientific perspective, you could say exciting, but actually really frustrating clash between the GDPR on the one hand and the most advanced frontier models on the other hand. So upshot here is when it comes to explainability and GDPR more generally, extremely significant tensions remain between the GDPR and Gen AI. And if we look at enforcement actions, they are actually picking up. I just talked about the hallucinations case. There are cases about the use of data for AI training that is being looked at, by the way, both in the EU and in the US, where there's a case that was filed against LinkedIn specifically, which is a part of Microsoft now, under a California statute and a federal statute for using customer data for AI training. It's also about transparency in privacy policies, and it's about the protection, not least, last but not least, of minors when they engage with those interfaces. And I just want to say one thing here. We all know that DeepSeek now has, of course, launched its model, R1, for example, which is almost on par with some of the most advanced models that were trained and developed by OpenAI and others. But here we already have a blocking order from the Italian Data Protection Authority. So the API and the app itself, the DeepSeek app, is not available in Italian app stores, and that is precisely because their privacy policy is so intransparent, and they were not giving any information as to what they're doing with the data that users prompt into this, other than that it's being siphoned off to China. And we all know that, unfortunately, the Chinese government has access. Well, I mean, we do not all know, but actually the TikTok case in the US revealed that the Chinese government does have access to a number of these, usually to all of these data points, and they can request it from companies. So this lack of transparency, both in processing and in privacy policies, is actually very worrying, and particularly so when it comes to data being siphoned off to countries with, let's say, at least a very dubious record of human rights enforcement. Now, basically what you have to do at the moment, to be quite frank, is you have to pick the government that you want to look at your prompting data, because of course, if you use a US engine, well, this will go to the US, and there are laws in the US as well that allow the government to look into this. With all the worrying tendencies that we have in the US concerning the rule of law, this might not be the most safe haven either. So you basically pick your government between the US and China. Gladly, we do still have some models in the EU as well. Think of Mistral, for example, in France. But I just want to say that this also links to really important geostrategic implications and questions. This quick excursion aside, let me come to my last point, and that is something that is even more connected to the future of our societies and the future of our planet, which is sustainability. Why this? I think that, and many people actually agree, and this is also now a topic at the AI Action Summit in Paris, the next frontier in responsible AI might well be the link between AI and climate change. And why this? Well, on the one hand, of course, AI has tremendous potential in helping mitigate climate change and help communities adapt to climate change. There are numerous applications that look at deforestation in the Amazon, that look at ways in which climate change triggered mass disasters can be better managed, can be predicted, and so on. But at the same time, it is also worth mentioning that the global GHG emissions by ICT, and that's information communication technology more broadly, and this is an estimate from 2021, were between 1.8 and 3.9% of global GHG emissions. You might say that's not a lot, but if you look at air travel, and this is often something that's being cited, as some of this a very significant contribution to to climate change, well, this is only 2.5%. So we're already in that range and probably well beyond it, because since 2001, these amounts have really skyrocketed. And there are projections that show that that estimate that until the year of 2027, the GHG emissions of AI alone will equal a country like Argentina, the emissions of a country like Argentina or the Netherlands. And what's really important, and this is fantastic work by my colleague Sasha Lucioni, climate lead at Hugging Face. So if you produce one image with a large image, like contemporary image generation provider such as Stability XL, that consumes as much energy as one smartphone charge. And really, when I started hearing about this, I stopped playing around with generating pictures just for fun, or for my kids, because it really consumes a lot of energy. Of course, we always have to ask ourselves, what would be the alternative if the AI wasn't doing it? What if a human was doing this? There's also consuming energy, so that all of these calculations are not as easy. And as I said, there are potential mitigation strategies using AI to combat climate change. But many of those, or almost all of those, do not involve those tools that consume the most energy and that hence emit most GHG, and those are the generative AI tools. And we also need to take into consideration that there are GHG costs of AI applications themselves, where, for example, it was recently revealed that in an article by Karen Heo in The Atlantic, that Microsoft, for example, was actively pitching its models to gigantic oil and gas corporations such as ExxonMobil to enable more efficient exploration of natural resources, which of course then also means more emissions. So I just want to use that as an example of saying that this is something to be taken very seriously. And this is a really excruciating question at the intersection of the two major transformations that we have in our modern societies, which is on the one hand digitization and AI, on the other hand climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation. So how can we go about going forward? I don't have a silver bullet solution for all of these, of course. I've written on a number of these points, but here are some proposals for reform. So one thing is, of course, to get smart leaders together. But this is an older picture from the New York subway, which was, of course, generated by AI. Now, what I think is important is to look at it from different dimensions. So one dimension is to look at technical standards for responsible AI, because it's always nice and easy to say, we all want peace, we all want, explainability, we all want fairness, but there are sometimes important trade-offs between these different categories. And it's also the case that for companies, it's often hard to comply with these broader principles if there are not specific metrics on the ground that allow them to incorporate these standards into their models. And this is where a lot of research is happening, but it's unclear at the moment which fairness metrics specifically work well for Gen AI and which ones would be the ones that are then, amongst those that work technically, are those that are legally compliant. Same for XAI, for explainable AI. Again, it would be good to define at the outset, what do we want? Do we want to know what kind of features led to a certain output, what prompt, what kind of training data? So those would be, and I would say it's probably a mix of those, depending on the situation. But based on what you want there, you would have, again, different techniques and metrics, and that would have to be built into an architecture that then can, at the end, be legally compliant. And when it comes to climate, I think there's lots of ideas on the table, and we have made a number of suggestions ourselves. We just published this paper, Climate AI and Regulation, with 12 policy interventions that we propose. I don't want to go through them in detail, but I just want to say that it all starts with good information practices, and reporting on the climate effects. And what the AI Act has, and that's what I'm going to end on, the AI Act does have some requirements for particularly GPAI, so general purpose AI providers, to disclose at least to the AI office, that is to the European regulator, not to the general public, but to the AI office, the amount of compute and the energy that went into the development of a model. But what we're seeing now is that, and this is again a work by Sasha Laccioni that was groundbreaking here, is that it's not the training of the models themselves that is consuming most of the energy. It is consuming a lot of energy. But once they are out, each inference, each time they are used, is consuming a bit of energy. And after about half a year, you have 100 million users or northward of that in OpenAI's case. After about half a year, these inferences take over. They're much more important than, cumulatively speaking, than the training. And this becomes ever more important now with the new reasoning models, because what does reasoning mean? It's of course wrong to say these models reason. They calculate for a longer time. So they just put more energy into refining the search and then the answers. And basically, this is what DeepSeek is doing as well, right? So it was pretty cheap to train, apparently. It was not as cheap as was reported. A lot of the fixed costs actually were neglected in the numbers that were tossed around, like the 6 million that it took to train this. It was likely much of an understatement. But what it is really heavy on, where it consumes a lot of compute, is in the inference space. Because in inference, it is one of those reasoning models like O1 or O3 in OpenAI's case that, again, goes through a lot of motions in order to engage in this. So what I want to say is that we need, of course, more of these studies that look at the inferences and that also bring inferences within the ambit of the AI Act. We have made an attempt for such an interpretation, but unfortunately, at the moment, the standard interpretation of the AI Act is that inferences are not covered by the AI Act, despite the fact that they are actually the biggest chunk in climate relevant AI processes. So we need better information, and we need certainly more interdisciplinary research. And by interdisciplinary, I mean both between different disciplines, but we also need more interactions between academics and people on the ground, like the people who are actually doing the work, the footwork in the companies, in the model designers, model providers, but also in those companies who are deploying this, so that everybody knows what's on the table, where the problems are, and how we can go about finding good solutions for mitigating them. So I just want to say that the future will certainly be exciting one way or another. Thank you so much for listening in, and I'm very much looking forward to the questions.
Fantastic, Philip. That's wonderful to have summarized in less than 45 minutes all the unique problems which are to do with Gen AI and explainability and discrimination and sustainability. So thank you so much. And you touched on some of the solutions, which I guess a lot of us are hankering to get to. But I know that there's been quite a lively chat going on in a chat function as well. And so I'm just going to take a few of those before opening up generally to anybody who would like to raise your electronic hands as well. And I know that, is it Lezel Rodok? I hope I'm not mispronouncing your name, and I hope you're still there. You had more than one question, but starting with something about synthetic data. Would you like to pose a question if you're there?
Yes, I'm here. Yes, it's Liesel Roddick, but thank you. Yes, I think my question was in the chat. One question related to the aspect of synthetic data and the role it plays with noisy data. And there was some discussions about whether that's technically possible or not, and whether it's only something that can work in theory. I've read some aspects of synthetic data where they say it's actually not that great, and it really just depends on the data set. That was my first question. And the second question relates to the type of explanations needed for operators under the AI Act. So you spoke about the difference between local and global explanations, but we know that the human oversight function is also required for deployers, and often the type of explanation you need differs depending on the user, and sometimes it's technically difficult to perform the human oversight function if you require different types of explanations for different user types. And I wondered, what role do you think know how because at the moment it seems that it's both on the deployer and the developer. And what role do you think I would say the developer of, I suppose it comes into fine-tuning when you're looking at generative AI. So that's sort of my question. So just those two, thanks.
Thanks. Those are excellent questions. And starting with the second question that you just explored, there's actually even two questions I'd say. So one is, what happens when you're fine-tuning a model, irrespective of explainability? And that is a big question, perhaps the biggest question in at least EU AI governance at the moment, because most of the companies that are using AI models want to fine-tune the model, or at least modify it to a certain extent so as to better match their own data and their own scenarios. But if the model that you're fine-tuning is a GPAI model, so a general purpose AI model, such as, Llama or GPT, whatever, then there is no specific article in the AI that says what's happening, which is why the AI office is working on some guidelines on this. But the upshot is that there is a recital 109, that was kind of put in at the later stage, basically in the AI Act, when it was already too late to I think deal with this properly in an article, because it was this 38-hour marathon, and it was just basically overlooked in the beginning. And I actually came together with a machine learning professor, Gerard de Melo from HPI, from Potsdam, and we formulated some thoughts around this that did not make it into the Act, but I think are still relevant. And the idea in recital 109 is that there is a limited degree of responsibility based on the fine-tuning that you're doing. Then it's only this kind of training data that you're responsible for example, with respect to transparency. Now, the problem is, if you're using a model that is systemically relevant, that is systemically risky, then it's not only Article 53 with the transparency provisions, but also Article 55 with AI safety evaluations, red teaming that you have to do, comes into play. And of course, you cannot say, oh, I'm only red teaming the model with respect to the fine tuning, only the upper left corner of the tensor, or what do you want to say? I mean, like, doesn't make any sense. So you then have the full range of AI safety mechanisms in Article 55, which apply to that fine-tuned model. And that then becomes really tricky, because many companies, even if you can do fine-tuning, they're not able to do good evals. I mean, even OpenAI, Meta, and so on are struggling with this. So that is a deep problem. And how does this link to transparency? Well, on the one hand, I would say it is a concern where providers of the GPA models should be very transparent about the fact that fine-tuning the model, even on a number of data points, might lead to a change of model behavior across the board. So in an extreme case, you could use 3 data points, it could change every single weight in the model. And so this is one thing you would have to be transparent about. Now, the question that you more specifically asked about, what kind of explanations, local or global, I think that really depends on the article you're looking at. So if it's Article 13, where that has transparency obligations, basically the idea being you have to enable the deployer to use the model properly. I mean, this is one thing that I guess, at least in general, would require more global explanations, because it's across a set of use cases, and you want to make sure that the deployer somehow knows how to deal with the model in a range of different scenarios. It doesn't have to be super specific, though. So it's basically like a sheet of instructions for use. But then you rightly point to the human oversight functionality, and you have to enable human oversight according to Article 14. And that then means that if human oversight can only be properly implemented if you know what is happening in the model, then basically that would be an indirect obligation for local explanations. For example, I mean, just pick one random example, the doctor would want to know, if you're looking at a sheet that where, you know, it flags a radiology image with says cancer, you know, it would want to know, yeah, why is that the case? You know, why is it why does it say this? Is it because of some funny label that the sheet had, that the image had originally, or is it really because of some spots somewhere in the lung region that triggered this? So yes, so there, I think with enabling human oversight, that is where, in certain cases, that might require a local explanation, I think. There's also, of course, Article 86, which looks at, which gives users or affected persons a right to explanations, but that is only insofar as this has not only already been granted in other union laws. So I think there, the GDPR usually goes further, or the other way around, put the other way around, the AI does not add anything substantial to what's already out there. Concerning synthetic data, that's a very good question. I'm not a technical AI person. I mean, I know a number of things, but you would have to, I guess, there is probably other people in the audience, and I've seen that some have already replied to this. And from what I know, that's perfectly correct. I mean, the synthetic data doesn't come out of nowhere. It depends how you synthesize, how you generate the data. You can do that, for example, with GANs, with generative adversarial networks. And then will depend on the original data distribution, the kind of the way in which the synthetic data is generated, which could again replicate biases. You can do data augmentation very consciously, trying to plug these holes. But again, the problem might be that you don't really know what you have to fill this with, precisely because it's not in the data, in the original data. So it's an imperfect cure at best, and it also brings along a number of other interesting questions, namely, to what extent are these data subject to the GDPR? If they are derived from personal data, but they're not, but they're then otherwise hypothetical, and so on. Great paper by Orla Linsky now at UCL on this question, for example.
Thank you, Philip. Great. It probably would be, there are 100 of you. I'm going to try and look at any electronic hands which are about to go up. But in the meantime, may I abuse the chair's position to ask you, Philip, a question around your reform proposal? The very first thing you said was that there should be technical standards for legally adequate Gen AI. So it's a two-part question. One is about the political economy, or how these technical standards might actually come about. So of course there's the government, and then there are professional associations, standard setting organizations, and all that. So I just wondered, what is your worldview on how best to go about coalescing all these different multiple stakeholders into consensus? And then the second is that some people would argue that these standards are too generic, too principled to fail. And so I just wanted to understand your views about how substantively embedded it should be in specific contexts, specific professions.
The standards, or the
actual standards themselves,
yeah, those are excellent questions. So for those of you who are not so familiar with the standardization framework, I mean, what's happening is that already now we have standards, ISO standards, on certain aspects of AI. There is a big standardization process underway at the European level, led by CEN-CENELEC, two standardization bodies, under JTC 21, which is the committee chaired by Sebastian Hallensleben, that is drafting these standards under the AI Act. Why are they important? They are extremely important because the AI Act actually only gives you half the meat, but the real transmission between the more vague legal terms and the operationalization in ML on the ground comes through these standards. And the standards have not been formulated yet. They are supposed to be revealed sometime or published in 2026, probably spring. If we get unlucky, it's going to be summer 2026, so roughly a couple of weeks before the main provisions of the AI kick in. And the political economy behind it is really quite fascinating and also a bit sad, because of course it's at the moment, it is a lot of big companies that are that have the capacities, quite frankly speaking, and the personnel power to take part in these considerations, which is a good thing, I think, in general, because these companies in the end do have to apply these standards, and it's good to bring them on board. But there would have to be some countervailing element of, civil society, academics, and so on. But even people that, are quite active in this space, such as, myself and my colleagues from the legal profession, none of us is in these standardization bodies because we just are in these meetings because we just don't have time. And same for the civil society organizations. And so what we've suggested before, and there are some studies, there are some programs underway, but not enough, is that there should be scholarships for example, civil society organizations, so that they could apply to it. And then this would fund one or two, say, whatever, PhD students or research assistants, basically, who can then go to these as a full-time job, go to these standardization meetings, and bring in a more diverse perspective. Because the problem is that at the end of the day, these standards might become very procedural and not substantive in nature, and that would mean that basically almost anything flies as long as you have certain elements, certain procedures in place, which doesn't guarantee you a good outcome. And with respect to the second question, how vertical, I guess, should these standards be? I think it is, there is language in the AI that says that these standards need to be integrated with, or integrate is not the word that was used there, but they kind of have to take into consideration existing standards. And the ideal world, of course, would be something like, I think, a more general standard across the board, and then vertical standards for automotive and so on and so forth. To a certain extent, that already exists. But again, I'm a little bit worried that there won't be time for this, at least not before the AI kicks in, because already the standardization organizations are struggling to find even a general layer, and do not really have time to dig into the verticals. But that would, I think, be a great solution, because then you have safe harbors for companies and researchers, frankly speaking, and deployers. Research is exempted from the AI Act, but once you make this public and you put it on the market, or you make it available, then it's not exempted anymore. And so these safe harbors would be really beneficial, because if you look at it from a global perspective, right now, there is a race between all the big industrial or post-industrial nations for attracting, of course, AI talent and AI investment. And one crucial role are these safe harbors for offering legal security, legal certainty to companies. And standards are playing a huge role in this. And the more specific and the more sector specific they can be, the better, I think.
Agreed. Thank you so much. So there's at least a couple of hands here. So let's go to Elspeth Crawford.
Hi, thank you so much. It's the first time I've heard you actually speak. I've read a lot of your work, and it's a little bit exciting, and I kind of had to filter it out to pick just one question. Particularly because I used some of your and Sandra Wachter's work in my thesis, which looked at algorithmic discrimination.
Oh, cool.
So kind of like hyperventilating a little bit, but sorry. I wondered if you could maybe just clarify some of the exceptions for providers of general purpose models that are producing those models through open source directives, and how I think often when you look at mitigation techniques, and even though the AI Act is this meta regulation, it's tempting to kind of, from a legal perspective, look at the law and go, okay, well, at least we have this, and this in place, and that while it's woolly, it gives some sort of guides there. And then you have like just a nice little exception in paragraph 2 of like, unless you're doing it open source. And I think for me, I'm just looking for a bit of clarity on how that all fits together with what you spoke on about explainability.
Yeah, so this is a very good point. But in fact, if you look at the open source exemption, interesting thing to note about is that there are a lot of exemptions from that exemption. In fact, there are more exemptions from the exemption than the real exemption is. So it's what is not exempted is if it's high risk. It's not exempted if it's GPI with systemic risk. And so basically the only thing that's really exempted is GPI without systemic risk. That's the transparency provisions, Article 53. And even there, the copyright provisions are not exempted. It's only the part that looks at basically all of the information that you have to give away about the model, about the design, and so on, because it's supposed that that is already contained in the open source part, because it's only open source if it fulfills certain requirements. Now, there is a big loophole, however, which I hadn't spotted before, certainly not during the negotiation, so I don't want to blame anyone. But what is not part of the open source requirements and would have to be usually disclosed under Article 53, but does not have to be disclosed by open source, is precisely the amount of energy that you need for the model. So all of this climate reporting, this is entirely voluntary for open source models. And so I guess the idea being, on the one hand, there is a kind of an incentive for open source models to, even become produced at all. And this is something that's usually good for competition and so on. I mean, there's many wrinkles to that, but I think most people are in the community fans of open source models. But then they're not the kind of models, of course, GPI models that, you sit together with 3 friends in the garage and you do this on an afternoon. But rather, who's producing open source AI models? It's Mistral AI, it's Meta. It's certainly not small small SMEs. Those are high-powered either startups or absolutely big tech corporations who would be in a very good position to fulfill all these requirements in the first place. So this is a bit worrying to me. And then, of course, what is also interesting in the code of practice, so many of you will know that at the moment, the EU, under the auspices of the AI office, is actually drafting a code of practice that will basically sub in until the standards are elaborated and have been published. So this code of practice, which will be voluntary by fulfillment, but hopefully many of the big providers will sign it. This code of practice is currently, as I said, being drafted by academics, actually. And one of the aspects there is the question of if the models, once they pass a certain threshold of performance, as they move closer to AGI, if they can be open source at all, or if at a certain moment in time you would have to say, these models are so potent and could be misused in ways that are really dangerous, that they should only come with certain guardrails that cannot be easily removed, so you can only access them, say, via a hosted application, some other kind of format that is not plain open source, because of the security risk involved. This is something that is quite under discussion, negotiation. There's a big debate in academia around this also. And this is one of the aspects that was not touched upon in the AI Act. It just says, you have to mitigate systemic risks. But how you do that is basically is up to the model provider, and with, of course, scrutiny by the courts later on. But this is one of the aspects where open source, again, pops up very prominently.
Great. So let's go to Hussein here.
Thank you very much. And this was a really impressive, great presentation, and I learned a lot. Thanks a lot. A very short question. Considering that there are billions and trillions of parameters, and there is the black box problem, I'm not sure it is really possible at all, but will more transparency, if it is possible, ever possible, really going to provide more protection? Or is it in the end going to be the next constant policy that we have experienced in data protection law? Thank you.
Yeah, this is a very good point. Is this kind of transparency of knowing what caused some kind of output, is this really desirable in the end, or is it just going to be some laundry list that nobody's going to look at? And I think for most people, this is going to be right, because in fact, under consumer protection law already, you have to disclose a list of the main factors if, for example, like Google or Amazon and so on are doing ranking exercises in e-commerce. but almost nobody, I mean, few people that I know look at this. The point being, however, that this is not so much thought to enable the, your individual John Doe on the street just looking up, oh, why did that output come out here? But it's rather to enable forensic watchdogs like NGOs or the regulators or also strategic litigation units to look at this. So it's more geared like financial market disclosures to experts who can then act as information intermediaries to propagate that information, other formats to other groups. And I think in this sense, yes, it can actually be quite beneficial. And also in the sense of enabling decision makers or users to override the AI model at the right point in time. So for example, you could say that you give an explanation, this explanation is somehow automatically produced and it's automatically monitored by another system. And even if it may be imperfect, it could be that if it's something that is either close to a criterion that is linked to bias, or if it's close to a criterion that's patently nonsensical, in this context. For example, we know about a lot of overfitting where the image recognition system actually did not look at the image itself. It did not say, oh, this is a face, but only because maybe there was this weird line in the background, like I have here. And if in most of the cases in the data set, there's this weird line in the background when you have a face and it learns there's a weird line, then it's a face. Now, if you know this, then these spurious correlations, then it could basically flag this to the user. I think that could be really useful too. So there are ways in which you can make this useful, but I agree, A, it's going to be really hard, and B, for the standard cases, it's often not going to make much of a difference, and people are not really going to look at it.
Great, thank you.
That's useless.
Did you want to come back, Hussein? Are you all right?
Yeah, oh, good. Yeah, thanks. Sorry, Hussein, thanks.
Okay, anybody else who wants to ask another question? In the meantime, if there isn't, I'm just gonna chip in again to ask. So you mentioned DeepSeek a couple of times, and I can't help myself asking you the question. So lots of media coverage is about, just what does this do to the kind of big tech competition, and the share price is going down, and also the national security type questions around it. But putting those things sort of aside, not totally, but my question would be, what is that company doing right with respect to the three issues that you raised? I think you hinted on sustainability, but I just want to understand.
Yeah. So I think sustainability is perhaps the easiest to answer, and that's a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, apparently they did find a way to train models with multi-head attention and sort of intriguing breakthroughs in both lowering dramatically the compute necessary in the attention mechanism, which is the key limiting factor in current transformer models, and using reinforcement learning, which is sort of an early stage of being used in these generative AI models, respectively speaking, vis-a-vis, supervised fine-tuning. So they had some pretty ingenious ways of coming up with compute cheap ways of training. So that's good. But as I said, this comes at a cost of a model reasoning or calculating for longer afterwards. So you have more costs on the inference. Plus, there is this paradox, this rebound effect that has been seen oftentimes. Cars now consume considerably less for a single kilometer or mile. Does this mean we have less gasoline consumption? No, of course not. People just drive more or buy bigger cars. I have e-cars or hybrid cars, but not your small ones. You have these hybrid SUVs that are still, gigantic energy guzzlers. So this is a real problem. I think it's called Jevons paradox or something. And that's same thing you can see in AI. It's getting cheaper to train. Of course, it will be used more, which to a certain extent is good if it's put to a beneficial case. But again, for the environment, that's not a solution. Second thing, if we look at transparency, I think this is This is fairly problematic with DeepSeek because on the technical end, I think the model is not more or less opaque than others, but transparency always has these two dimensions. There's the technical dimension, and there's the, say, corporate dimension in the sense of how do you share information about what's going on, which is irrespective of the AI model. I mean, it could be just any kind of product, and you can share more or less of how the product is built and so on. And this is something where certainly there's much to be desired from that company. And a couple of regulators from the EU data protection authorities have reached out and have not gotten any sufficient or response. OpenAI, by the way, I've also seen in the chat, people remarked, yes, ChatGPT was blocked too. Yes, by the Garante, the Italian data protection authority, which is taking on some kind of lead role in the EU at the moment. Funnily enough, nobody expected this in AI enforcement. ChatGPT was blocked, but only for a couple of weeks. And OpenAI was actually, they sent a team, they really negotiated with them, apparently in good faith. And this was, I can't say it was resolved, but, it was at least moved to a point where ChatGPT was allowed to function in Italy again. Now, it's unclear whether it's going to work in the same way with DeepSeek because they've been much more confrontational or let's say much less cooperative, at least so far, for as much as I know. And if you look at the privacy policy, I mean, it's really kind of funny. When I do privacy policies with my students in my GDPR classes, I give them a couple of examples that are really red flags. Like if you do this as a plain violation, for example, saying I'm sharing data with my partners, you have to say which partners. You can't just say my partners, but this is precisely what DeepSeek is doing. And also note that they are even capturing data about your keystroke patterns. Okay, which is some. I mean, I don't know if you really want some Chinese company looking at your keystroke patterns. And so for that, it's very opaque from a corporate perspective. And then when it comes to bias, of course, there is, well, a kind of bias engineered into the model, such as that it will not answer questions or it will not criticize Chinese government. This is something that I guess most people can somehow deal with because it's to a certain extent expected, but it would be good if this was made more transparent as well. People have tried to extract the system prompt behind this, so basically the instructions that are within the model to make it conform with Chinese legislation. In fact, it's legislation in China about being conformed to communist ideology there. This I think is perhaps the least worrying one because it's clearly to be expected, but it's also something to be taken into consideration. But of course, Western models have Western biases as well, so this is not something that's very unique to Chinese models.
Yeah, great. Well, that's the fullest answer I've got recently around what DeepSeek is doing or attempting to do. That's great. It appears that there's a live chat discussion going on, but nobody's raising hands, which means that maybe this is come to conclusion around talking about this for now. So it remains for me to thank Philipp for an incredibly extensive but very concise statement of his views around responsible generative AI and more kind of pitching for problems, but beginning of thinking about what the solutions might be. So thank you so much. And also a kind of heads up for the interdisciplinarity of the kind of audience that you had. And I really appreciate your openness in discussing around these issues as well. So before we thank him, I also want to just in 2 weeks' time, exactly 2 weeks' time on Monday, so that's on the 24th of February, somebody who is actually in the audience, Carlo Cadasco, who is a philosopher working in a business school. I've just looked at your LinkedIn profile, which is great. He's at Alliance Manchester Business School, and he'll be actually nice kind of handover, zooming in on the ethics of explainability in human and machine decision making. So if you can make it, please do join in 2 weeks' time. Okay, so for now, thank you so much, Philipp, for this first kickoff meeting. Really, really appreciate it. And for all of you who have been busy live to join us as well. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks to you. Great audience, great questions, and we're really looking forward to your talk, Carlo, particularly with human and machine decision making. That should be really intriguing. Thank you.
Great. Bye for now, everybody.
Thank you very much. Thank you.